Yes, press the ticket, please.
There you go. Question.
Okay, I think we're going to get started. Okay, thank you guys so much for persevering through a long day of dense, but I think important discussions. We have saved, and I will say this, even though it's prejudicial to the prior panels, we have saved what I think is the most richly interesting, publicly accessible, sort of inside dirt type conversation for last, which is a conversation about how the press covers the court and the relationship between the court and the media. And as has been our norm today, I'm going to briefly introduce our three exceptional panelists and really encourage you guys to check out their full bios in the online materials that are available to you through the QR codes. So first to my immediate right is Amy Howe. Amy has so many sort of relationships to cover in the court, but most importantly, right, is a reporter for SCOTUS blog, writes the How on the Court blog for her own website, is just a fantastic resource on all things the court does. When you think SCOTUS blog, or when I think SCOTUS blog, I think Amy and Tom and the whole universe. Okay, to Amy's right is Ariane DeVogue. Ariane is the Supreme Court reporter for CNN, and also my boss in that capacity, so hey boss. Yes. Well, anyway, Ariane has been covering the court for longer than I'm allowed to publicly say, but was at ABC before CNN and is at the front of what I think is CNN's very, very good coverage of the court. To my left is my friend and Cardozo University law professor Kate Shaw, who is also ABC's Supreme Court analyst. So hopefully a very, very rich diversity of viewpoints. Amy and Ariane, I want to start with you. I'm not sure folks understand what it actually means to cover the Supreme Court. So before we get into sort of some of the deeper, I don't know, debatey question, just like mechanically, like what does covering the court entail? How does it happen? What's changed like since COVID, right? What might people be surprised to hear about covering the Supreme Court?
Well, I can start a little bit because I've covered it so long, and I think it might be interesting to tell you a little bit how it used to be when I first started and I was part-time, and I'd go and you'd listen to arguments, and then all the press would get together and we'd have lunch and talk about it. And then people would have gotten back to their offices. We'd call a couple of sources. What'd you think about arguments? What did he mean when he said that? What's that? And then maybe we'd get to the lawyers, and then we'd digest it some more, and maybe we'd go back and we'd read some of the opinions, you know, just to look. And then we'd file. Now, flash forward, not that many years. I mean, I know I'm old, but I'm not that old. You go up and you hit the arguments. You listen so carefully. I write and I listen for television, so I'm thinking, you know, what would be good audio? What would be good bites for a piece? And you come running down and you file a couple of sentences just to sort of say, especially if you know which way the court is going to go, or if you don't, if a justice has said something super surprising, and you get cracking right away, and then you get a transcript. In the old days, the transcript wouldn't say which justice was even speaking. We had to beg and plead for that change. And then you go through the transcripts, and then the beauty and what makes it so difficult of journalism today is you continuously update. So read my story at 10, but come back at 10:30, and then come back at 1, because as you digest it, So that's sort of the basic mechanics of what it is to cover the court now. And it really has been impacted by this change in journalism, which is the immediacy that has become the norm.
I would echo all of that. I mean, I think one of the things that is hard to imagine if you don't know the mechanics of covering the court is how much time we actually just spend sitting in front of our computers to get to the point that we're going up to the courtroom to cover the Supreme Court. And so, Jen Mascott talked about how the court was transparent. And that is one way in which the court is transparent, that everything that gets filed at the Supreme Court is available online, so that you can do it from, I happen to live in Washington, D.C., and Ariane does as well. You could do your job from really anywhere around the country or the world, for that matter. Another thing that is, I think, somewhat surprising to people is, Steve talked about the access that the reporters who have permanent credentials have to the justices. We have very little access to the justices. Like, if you watch CNN's congressional coverage, you'll see these really energetic young people who sort of stand around in the hallways waiting for members of Congress to come by so that they can get comments. There are several Supreme Court justices I've never even met after covering the court for all this time. And everything has become, to a certain extent, even more remote during COVID. The justices went to live streaming the audio for the first time. Until then, the oral argument audio was only available on the Friday following the oral arguments. And all of a sudden you could listen to it live, which is a wonderful thing for public access to the arguments. From a reporter's perspective, it means that many reporters, editors, are saying, now that the court is back in session, I don't even want you to go to the courtroom, because something like the affirmative action arguments coming up next week, they could easily take 3 or 4 hours. I want you in the newsroom where you can start filing your stories immediately.
Amy, can I ask, just before turning to Kate a bit, can you talk a bit about SCOTUS blog specifically? I mean, it seems to me, SCOTUS blog just started becoming a thing when I was in law school, so many eons ago. I wonder, sort of, from your perspective, right? Like, what is SCOTUS blog doing that conventional media isn't? And, I mean, do you think it has changed anything about sort of how the public, the sort of lower court, how people are getting their news about SCOTUS?
So to answer the first question, so we started SCOTUS blog in 2002, and the way I remember this is because I happened to be pregnant with our first child. I co-founded the blog with my husband, Tom Goldstein, and he came to me and he said, I've got this great idea, we should start a blog about the Supreme Court. And I said, that's the stupidest idea I've ever heard. So here we are 20 years later. And I think the main thing that distinguishes us is just that we comprehensively cover every single case at the Supreme Court that is argued on the merits. So Ariane and everybody else who covers the court for the sort of more mainstream media, they're limited by what their editors are willing to put online. The really high profile cases, or something like the Custine cheerleader case that we talked about a little bit this morning, which doctrinally may not have been particularly significant, but was just a really fun case to cover. But we cover all of them, the bankruptcy cases, the ERISA cases, we cover everything from soup to nuts. But we try to do it. My husband argues cases before the Supreme Court, so there's been some issues with our press access, but we try to cover it the same way that CNN would, in terms of coming at it totally objectively, not with an eye towards burnishing the law firm's reputation.
Just one last, I mean, the live blog, right, is a more recent innovation, right? The sort of the live blog on decision days. And I'm curious, I mean, do you think like there was always the appetite for that kind of real-time, instantaneous access to the decisions, and that it's just the technology that's changed? Or do you think that like there's more, I mean, I guess which is the chicken, which is the egg, right? Like Ariane talks about a time when, after the Supreme Court would do something, people would take a breath. Right, there's this remarkable story about how Sarah Weddington, the lawyer who argued Roe versus Wade, she finds out that the court had ruled and that she had won when a reporter calls her asking for comment, right? Those days are behind us, right? And I'm curious, like, do you think the live blog is sort of symptom of the shift? Is the shift, I mean, like the sort of this instantaneous, we want to know about SCOTUS right now, how has that changed how SCOTUS blog thinks about it?
One of the reasons for the live blog was that back in the day, and I've been doing this for a while as well, there used to be a gap between when the decisions were available at the Supreme Court, if you either sat in the courtroom or stood in the court's public information office and they started handing out paper copies of the opinion, and when they were posted online. And so that was one of the things that the live blog was intended to address. And over the years, it sort of morphed into an area, if you're really interested in the outcome of a case, it's just as fast for you to click on the Supreme Court's website itself and download the opinion. But I think there is an appetite for discussion of the cases and what's going on at the Supreme Court more broadly. It's kind of a fun online community. That's one of my favorite parts of the job. Over the years, we peaked with the Affordable Care decision in 2012. Part of the reason that we don't necessarily have as many followers on the live blog as we once did is because you can also see analysis by really smart people like Steve Laddick on Twitter at the exact same time.
But I would say that you're just being too polite, because I think that SCOTUS blog is a main reason why so many people suddenly got interested in the Supreme Court beat, which is a tough beat. It's not as easy as the White House. It's not as easy as Congress, as far as to get the average guy in. And then you talk about Steve, who I've worked with for years, has this ability to not talk like too much of a lawyer when we're on deadline, which we're desperately in need of. And then, for instance, and for the law students here, if you talk about podcasts, strict scrutiny. I was driving the other day and Kate gave this definition for the dormant commerce clause while I was listening to something, and I almost drove off the road because it was such a good definition that I knew I needed to steal. And that just goes to show you that right here, you're seeing a panel of people who have really made this beat much more digestible for the average guy. And that has been, as the only person who's not a lawyer who's probably appeared on this panel today, that has always been my goal, and it's been helped by people like this.
I was, as you were describing almost driving off the road, I'm having a Paul's graph flashback about, Kate's potential liability. So I mean, Kate, you and I, our jobs are different, but in some respects they're similar, right? Which is that we are, law professors by day and Supreme Court analysts by night.
And we also host podcasts.
And right, and podcasters by whatever's after night. I guess I'm curious, like, how did you come into the ABC part, right, of all your Supreme Court stuff, and what do you see what is different about what you do from what Ariane and Amy do?
Sure. So yeah, I'm a contributor with ABC, and I've been a contributor for about 6 years there. And I'm going to tell one quick story, which is when I came on board, I met like a young producer who knew that I was a law professor and that I'd clerked on the Supreme Court, and she was like, "Oh, you're gonna have the best sources inside the court." And I was like, "It's not really that kind of a beat." And of course, cultivating relationships with lawyers, advocates, yes, but actually trying to get information out from inside the sort of cloistered world that is the Supreme Court is not at all how I understand my role as a Supreme Court commentator and resident of the ecosystem of Supreme Court journalism and commentary. So I do view now, again, some people obviously have relationships with justices. Obviously, Nina Totenberg's most recent book is very, about her relationship with Justice Ginsburg and, Scalia and others as well. So there are absolutely people on this beat for whom source cultivation is definitely part of the job. It is just not how I view my role at ABC, right? My role is to try to understand and help explain the opinions the court is issuing. And I do try, I think, to talk about the court as an institution in ways that Steve has been underscoring all day. We all kind of need to be endeavoring to do better. And also to try to talk about, developing kind of lines of or intersecting lines of doctrine the way Josh was talking about with respect to these seemingly isolated cases that in the aggregate really do just kind of increase the power and authority of the Supreme Court. So I do try to do all that, but the limitations of a very short bite on television are real. And so it's difficult, I think, if that's the medium in which you're operating, to do all that, which is, for me, why I love having a podcast where we can go much deeper on the court's cases, and hopefully in less, kind of atomistic ways about individual cases, and talk more broadly about themes and institutional dynamics. But in terms of sort of how to explain and to engage, to try to make things interesting enough that people will listen to what sometimes can be dry and technical, and inside these kind of media institutions, to try to lobby to do more, to talk about the court, because I do think that it is an under-examined and underappreciated in terms of its impact and reach institution sort of in our collective political lives. So maybe I'll stop there if that's it.
Well, and I think an institution that actually depends upon its press corps, right, in ways that I think are not necessarily true to the same degree of others. I mean, I guess, so this is a question I want to put to Ariane and Amy first, and then to Kate, which is, so what do you see as the sort of the unique role of the Supreme Court's press corps as such, right, vis-a-vis the institution, versus like people who come in and come out, like journalists who, come in to write about the court and then go back to their, like, what do you see as the role of the court's press corps in disseminating information about the court, and how, if at all, do you think that's changed, right? Not just the mechanics of it, but like the actual sort of purpose of it, right, during your time doing it.
I guess I don't see it as particularly unique compared to other reporting in terms of talking about the court as an institution. I think that it winds up being different because of things that we've already talked about today, in terms of the lack of access, in terms of the way that the Supreme Court is not particularly transparent. One of the things that I didn't mention but wanted to mention earlier that has been affected by COVID is that after COVID, when COVID started, the Supreme Court started initially putting its opinions online. The Supreme Court before COVID would announce their opinions from the bench. They'd come in, and the justice who had the majority opinion will read a summary of his or her opinion from the bench. There are opportunities for the justices to read their dissents as well. That obviously stopped when the justices were no longer in the courtroom, but then last term, the justices go back to the courtroom with live audio, although with a limited audience. They are continuing, at least through last year, they haven't said anything about this year, to release their opinions online, which I think, particularly given some of the major cases that they decided last year, to have them just sort of show up as a link on the court's website really is something that needs to change. I think that they were concerned about, they've never liked the idea of having a live stream or even audio of their opinion announcements of being available quickly. I mentioned that before COVID, they only released the audio of arguments at the end of the week. The audio from opinion announcements is not available until the following fall, right, at the National Archives, for reasons that are inexplicable to me.
So, there's this moment, right? So in 2007, there's parents involved, the Seattle school case, and Breyer has this line. Breyer reads his dissent from the bench, and he has this line in his oral dissent, right? Never in the law have so many changed, have so few changed so much so quickly, right? But it's not in his written dissent. Do you think that, do you think this is they don't want that clip running on Ariane's hits on the nightly news? Is that what's going on?
I think that's 100% what's going on. There is also the ostensible reasoning for it is that the justice in the majority or the justice in the dissent prepares this summary by his or herself without the other justices who've joined the opinion signing off on it. And so the idea is that they don't want that out there, sort of one person speaking for the court with something that is not necessarily in the opinion. I think that's a little bit of a straw man. There are ways to deal with that, and particularly when you hear Justice Barrett saying, read our opinion, or you have justices complaining about how the Supreme Court press corps gets their decisions wrong. My response is, there is actually a way that you could deal with that. The fact that you choose not to is not my problem.
Well, one of the reasons, though, that I think they choose not to is that they haven't wanted ever to have cameras in the courtroom, and they were very not wanting to give us live audio. And one of those reasons, if you remember, well, some of you are probably too young, but in the healthcare cases, when the lawyer for the government,
Yeah, Don Verrilli. Yeah.
stood up to begin his argument. He got something caught in his throat, which happens to me all the time, and he started coughing and he couldn't get it out, and it was a bad start for him. So Republicans actually took that audio and used it in campaign ads as a way to sort of say, look, the government can't even like explain this healthcare. And that made the justices furious, and that really set back the cause, because they do not want that in campaign commercials. They don't want their audio to start popping up, right?
I mean, I agree with that, but we've now had almost 2 full years
And
of
it's
live
never happened.
audio with
Yeah.
the only problem that they've had was a
The
toilet
toilet flush.
And that was certainly not the lawyer's fault.
So, I mean, but I guess, I think this is picking up though on what I guess was the intended theme of the question, right? Which is, are there features of the court's behavior, right, that complicate your job as journalists, right? And that complicate sort of your ability to do what, if you had your druthers, you would do in covering court as an institution.
Well, I think if you look at, because I have covered the White House a little bit, and I've had to cover the Hill. And so, for instance, when the White House releases some really tough executive order that is going to be very technical, you get talking points. And you may get them on background or off the record, but you were handed talking points before, because they want you to understand this. They want you to be able to process it. You ask questions. Not so at the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is very different. So if you're sitting in oral arguments and they bring up a case from, decades ago, and if you don't know what that case is, you can't understand where that justice is going. So the amount of homework it takes on RB is much different, because there's nobody sort of helping you understand that. Another thing that I think is pretty stunning, the differences between covering the court, for instance, and covering the White House, and this is my thing right now that I'm so furious about, is that they have really gone backwards in telling us when they're going to give speeches. And that may seem silly to you, like, why not? But here I am in Washington, and I'm in charge, and my bosses want me to know when Chief Justice John Roberts is going to give a speech. And the court has stopped really announcing that. So I spend all my time trying to figure out, oh my goodness, is there going to be, where next are we going to hear a justice pop up? That would never happen in the other branches of government. And when we go to those speeches, when you go, and if I was a White House reporter and President Biden was over there, drinking a glass of wine with somebody, and the press was allowed in, I would go in and I would ask President Biden a question. The court, on very many of these appearances, they're ground rules that you're not allowed to approach the justices. So it is quite different covering the court. They expect to be treated differently, and very often I think it's just not right.
So, I mean, on the speeches point, so I had mentioned, there's the sort of there's the public inaccessibility, but also just like, it seems like one might defend the lack of publicity about the speeches if they weren't making news in the speeches, right? But we have seen, I think consciously, right, the justices, they know when they say some of the things they have said in their speeches over the last 2 years, they know, one, that is news, and two, that it is news that will be reported. And it seems like wanting to preserve the accuracy of those comments ought to be a goal. But Kate, I'm curious, you come at this from a slightly more holistic, right, perspective, but like, how do you see the sort of the nature of the court's operations affecting how we do what we do?
Yeah, that sort of in the aggregate, all of this kind of behavior suggests to me that the court, is quite deliberately kind of restricting access by the press and the public to everything it does. I mean, what Jen said is what the justices will often say, like, we are the most transparent institution in government. You can see our reasoning and our opinions. Well, as Steve has now been reminding us for years, that's actually not true a lot of the time in some of the really high impact shadow docket activity in which the court doesn't tell us anything about why it is doing what it is doing. But even if it's on the merits docket, maybe I don't even know if we should sort of call it the merits docket anymore. It suggests the rest of it's not merits, and anyway, it's the court's ordinary argued and signed written opinions. If the president just issued executive orders and that was it, and said, look, you can see my law, like, that would be insane, right? And it's not that the court needs to give a member of the press pool access to all the justices' activities so the justices can be trailed the way the president is trailed. But the court ordinarily doesn't behave like it understands itself to be a minimally democratically accountable body. And I think that it really does make it very difficult. And I am sort of on the periphery. I mean, before COVID, I did go to arguments in the big high-profile cases. And so I am not the hard pass holder for ABC. So I have a wonderful colleague, Devin Dwyer, who is the hard pass holder. So he goes to basically every argument. But I can go and I can sit, you know, in one of the further back rows in the press section. And it is just, you know, it is sort of, it feels kind of by design hostile to individuals who aren't intimately familiar with the folkways of the Supreme Court. And having clerked there, actually, I'm pretty familiar with it. But the press room is a room that I, as a clerk, never had access to. And, you know, so there's both kind of the sort of having to navigate the actual spaces of the kind of bowels of the court, but also just to navigate the folkways of sort of trying to get access and to cover the court. Like maybe, let me give two quick examples, or maybe just one. You know, the court makes it difficult, but will grant like day passes to members of the press who are not part of the press corps, which is a, you know, pretty small. Think about how many reporters full-time cover Congress or the White House, and then how many full-time reporters cover the Supreme Court. And, you know, there's only 9 justices. It's small in number compared to like Congress, but in terms of impact of decisions, it's enormous. And it's a small body and largely specialized. So if you come in from out of town, so I'm thinking of both the marriage equality case, Obergefell, and actually more recently Bostock, the sex discrimination, you know, gender identity and sexual orientation discrimination as sex discrimination case. And there were a lot of reporters from, you know, all over the country who weren't typically on the Supreme Court beat. And the court gave out a lot of day passes, and most of the reporters who aren't sitting, you know, in the front couple of rows can't see the justices. There's these thick curtains, and so you're behind the curtains. And it was really interesting to kind of be surrounded by people who just, again, were not sort of acculturated into the Supreme Court as an institution. And, you know, you don't see the justices, and all you hear is their voices. So these local reporters kept being like, who's that? Who's talking? You know, and I was like having to sort of like sign, like, that's all you know, that, you know, but it's just sort of, there are all of these ways that it feels like if you aren't already deeply steeped in the institution, it's very, very difficult to break in. And then I wonder whether, and I think I'm guilty of this too, those of us who have been in the court a lot, become kind of inured to some of the eccentricities, like I guess is a nice way of putting it, of the court. And people who come in from outside are like, it's kind of weird. They like sit up there with like these wizard robes and like literally are on a different physical plane than the rest of us. And the police, who are wonderful, but the Supreme Court police are very strict. And if you slump too far in one direction, they will poke you and make you sit really still, like, and straight. You can't doze, you can't read in the courtroom. And so these are things that we have all kind of acclimated to. But I think that when outsiders come in, they realize that that's kind of a weird way for, you know, an institution of government to behave. And it's kind of good to be reminded of that. But if outsiders aren't really even given the access to remind the rest of us, like, that's just not going to happen.
Well, apparently the Public Information Office used to have someone whose job it was to hold up signs for the reporters who couldn't see who was talking, and this is Justice Scalia.
Oh, did they? So that's before my time.
They don't do it anymore, however,
interesting.
and we don't know why they stopped. Just to, not to beat a dead horse, but one of the things that all of the justices like to say is the court speaks through its opinions. Which sounds really great, except that they don't always speak just through their opinions. They're at these speeches to which we do not have access, or they're issuing orders that don't actually speak.
So I guess, I mean, picking up on the theme, I guess, you know, we've talked a bit, I mean, COVID was this interesting inflection point, right, where it required the court to make some accommodations that it did not want to make, right? Live streaming audio was just necessary, right? I think it's just about the only court in the country that didn't even let counsel participate through video, right? That you had to argue, if you argued a case in the fall of 2020, you literally had to do it through a speakerphone. I'll just say that was the worst 40 minutes of my life, right? I guess I'm curious, like, how much of what has changed in covering the court is COVID related, and how much of it is actually different but contemporaneous shifts, right, in what the court is doing and how we're thinking about it?
Well, I think one of the things that, well, first of all, I have to say as a reporter, I was thrilled for my children and for the country when they decided to do the live audio. I think it's super important. As a journalist who wasn't in the courtroom and suddenly it was live audio, and my editor, like every 5 minutes, was like, can you write that up? And I'm like, oh my God, I can concentrate on the whole
Right,
argument.
they just made news 4 minutes into the argument.
Wait, and if I start writing like this, I'm not going to hear something. So that part I didn't like. I'm really grateful now that we're back in the courtroom. Don't tell my editor, but because then I can really concentrate. But another thing that came out, I think there was an interesting thing that occurred because of COVID, and I think it has really fundamentally changed the court. And I think the jury's not in yet, but before COVID hit, Justice Thomas never talked. He very rarely said anything. And Roberts was really bothered by the amount of times that there were interruptions. So COVID forced a change, right? They suddenly had to change. And the court doesn't often change. And this was a big change. So they tried to figure out new ways to handle oral arguments. And they began just sort of in a stilted way with each justice going and saying what they wanted. And that was very stilted, and they sort of lost this give and take. But one person liked that very much, and that was Justice Thomas, because Justice Thomas did not like that curly-burly, he does not like people interrupting. He doesn't like to interrupt. He's always saying, I'm so sorry to interrupt. So suddenly they said, whoa, Justice Thomas is participating. And a lot of people were super happy about that, to hear him really engage instead of in his opinions. So then they thought, okay, this is good. And then they changed it a little bit because, and Justice Kagan has said this publicly, she felt like that was stilted. So now what they do is the justices can ask their questions, but then there's two parts of the argument. There's a little bit of a give and take, and then each justice has their own time to really get at something if they want to. So it has changed. That's a big change. But the only thing I will tell you, and I am dreading Monday because of this, because we have a huge affirmative action case on Monday, is that justices in the oral arguments are taking really forever. Like they've gone like an hour overtime, but that's a huge change. It came from COVID, and it'll be fascinating to see, when we look back at it, what difference it made.
Yeah, I mean, I think, so I think especially for the law students, right? So when it was the Rehnquist court, which is when you clerked, right? Early Roberts. I'm dating myself, but right, but I'm going to regret that for the rest of my life. Chief Justice Rehnquist was infamous, right, for when the red light came on, you didn't get to finish the word, right? Like I have one last, and that was like, right? And so we saw Chief Justice Roberts be a little friendlier with the red light. You can now finish the word, right? But with COVID, like we've seen, like order has collapsed in ways that are really interesting. But okay, at the risk of being really annoying, I'd like to shift away from covering arguments, though, right? Because I think that sort of, right, I want to talk about covering the rest of what the court did. We talked about speeches and how hard it is to cover speeches. I guess, and Kate, maybe you can start, like from a substantive perspective, right? Like, are there things we can be thinking about from the perspective of covering the court that does try to get at some of these more holistic themes and patterns? That, is it just the business of journalism is so presentist that it's hard to take broader looks? Like, how do we bridge that gap?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we could definitely all sort of do much better as kind of, media institutions and organizations. I mean, I think a couple of things. One, my general impression is that folks who focus on the Supreme Court inside larger media outlets, obviously, SCOTUS blog is really going to focus on the Supreme Court, and that is an unbelievable public service and public value. So this does not at all apply to SCOTUS blog. But I think that the rest of kind of media organizations that have sort of broader missions and mandates tend to be pretty siloed. And so I am not sure whether major media organizations understand some of the, on the ground post-Dobbs, the case that obviously overturned Roe, impact coverage as being kind of Supreme Court coverage, right? So reproductive rights and justice in the states, is that a Supreme Court story? Not really. It's not usually told in that way. And yet, of course, it is a direct result of the Supreme Court decision in June. And so I think there are ways to kind of understand the Supreme Court and the impact of Supreme Court opinions beyond just the day on which they are issued. And so I think that's sort of one thing, is to think in a more kind of integrated way about sort of how we're telling stories where there is, a significant Supreme Court angle to the stories. And that, I think, helps, right? The public, memories are short, the news cycle is fast. Like, I worry that people will begin to forget that the reason that states have been permitted to prohibit or severely restrict abortions is because of something the Supreme Court did at the end of June. And that's not that long ago, and it already feels like it's fading a little bit from people's memories. And so I think that could be done differently and better. In terms of the live audio, sorry, this isn't directly responsive, but it is one thing I wanted to sort of disagree with literally just one thing that you said today, Steve, which is Steve said we should be sort of appreciative or give credit where credit is due to the Chief Justice for continuing the live streaming of the oral arguments. And actually here I think no, they had to do that, and it would have been outrageous if they hadn't, and we should have demanded and expected it. And they don't get any gratitude or thank you for, this act of grace. They would have had no justification for rolling it back, and it would have been outrageous had they done it. So that's my one point of disagreement. But the kind of integrated idea of coverage, and also just, to try to think, more broadly, both temporally and kind of substantively, about the impact of Supreme Court opinions. And then I think this is, again, slightly different, not perfectly responsive, but I thought that the example of kind of TransUnion versus Mahanoy, the Snapchat cheerleader case, is really illustrative. But there is an undeniable truth to the kind of human need for narrative and character, right? And so it is just harder to get to, convince editors and producers to do stories about Supreme Court cases that don't have people and drama at the heart of them. But I think there are ways to try to find impact stories, even if you're talking about potential impact, where you can generate narrative and, drama and characters, even if it's a question that's really about the right interpretation of a provision of the Clean Water or Clean Air Act, but thinking about what a ruling in one direction or another would mean on the ground for people, I think is something that I want to try to do better, but I think might be one way to solve the problem of how difficult it is to get people engaged and interested in dry and technical Supreme Court cases and questions.
Although, if we're picking on Steve, I'll pick on him now, because it'll be my turn. So
Because you're his boss, so.
I'm not his boss.
I have gotten through most of today pretty unscathed, so I guess this is where we
You're getting
go.
picked on now, because so I read, because I was a little late, so I read your piece this morning, and at first I realized I was getting a little defensive, and I thought, what's he talking about? I love strange bedfellows. I think strange bedfellow stories are so interesting. When Gorsuch suddenly sides with the liberals on that Bostock case, or when Gorsuch goes after Alito and Alito goes back, I think those stories are great stories. And I also think that if your goal is like my goal, where you're trying to draw more people in to understand the court, and if you can tell those stories, I agree, they're incremental, but I think that they're great stories to tell, and I think we have to tell them to keep the thread. That said, when I stop being defensive and I realize, I don't do enough to cover the institution afterwards, usually because news is just coming at me. But there are things that I think we have done. For instance, a lot of people have talked about the abortion case and what happened with the abortion case. But another thing about process is when you get these opinions and suddenly either you get it online or we used to be handled it, the first thing you want to do is you want to come down with the bottom line. Like, what did the court just do? But sometimes even your lead changes. Because, for instance, if you look at that Second Amendment case that we had last term, well, the lead was, right, that they struck down that law. But very quickly, your lead changed when you realized that Thomas had actually changed the framework of all the ways courts will look at laws going forward. So that's a way sort of the process there is interesting. And now a way to look at that, thinking about the institution, is to see what's happening on the ground right now. Well, many people didn't think that was very sexy when that opinion came down. What does it mean, framework? Like, what does it mean that you have to look at the historical tradition? Well, guess what? Now judges are all looking at that opinion, and suddenly we're getting a federal law was struck down, and the federal law barred people from scratching out a serial number on a weapon. Well, this judge says, there were no serial numbers in history, back in tradition. And he was almost, I thought, and you guys would know better than I thought he was kind of being like, you wanted this Supreme Court, here you are.
Oh no, he was clearly trolling the court.
I thought so, and I thought it was really good, but that's maybe a better way, and we should do more of those stories once we get away from the strange bedfellows, which I still love, right. But then look back and see, what else happened?
I think this is a friendly amendment, so I have no problem with strange bedfellow stories. I just want to retire the term because I don't really want the visual of what we are implying about the strange bedfellows.
All right, maybe. All right.
Call them strange car fellows, and it's a better term. Okay. I actually, so I think that last point's actually, though, such an important one, Ariane, because it seems to me that one of the traps that I think, certainly I fall into, and I suspect maybe we all do to different degrees, is that we're so focused on the Supreme Court that we are focused on the Supreme Court and not what everyone else is doing in reaction to the Supreme Court. And so, I think, for example, I've been trying to, draw more attention to this really quirky thing that keeps happening in Texas, right, where litigants are filing in single judge division so they can handpick their friendly neighborhood district judge, right? Like, the Supreme Court is directly implicated in that because these are cases that are meant to go to the Supreme Court. These are cases that are trying to take advantage of the Supreme Court. So maybe as part of it that, like, the Supreme Court press corps itself ought to be doing more court press.
I think to a certain extent, though, it's a resources issue. You talked yesterday and you've talked today about questioning whether there is a relationship between the smaller number of merits cases and the shadow docket. We're covering all of that. And as much as I'd love, and like most terms, I have these grandiose goals of looking at things like this and writing a story about it, and then they go by the wayside because there's so much else going on. CNN, you've got the two of you, and you've got Joan Biskupik, who's sort of taking the bigger picture look at what's going on at the court. The New York Times right now is hiring, or may have already hired, somebody else to cover the court, less with a focus on the merits cases in the shadow docket, but then sort of the politics and the relationship with other institutions of the federal government. And I think that's terrific.
So I can't resist, Amy, because you brought up the shadow docket. I want to ask about the shadow docket, right? Can we talk about covering the shadow docket? Because it seems like every once in a while, I will tweet something about how unfair it is to the people who cover the court that the court acts this way, and I get piled on, like, that's their job, right? Can we talk a bit about sort of how the ramping up of important decisions at all hours with no explanation has impacted your jobs?
Well, I think that one of the toughest things about the shadow docket, just as a human being, is it very often, you got to sit and wait for the justices to rule. You are not, like, for instance, right now, we're waiting for a petition. It's just become ripe. It's Senator Lindsey Graham, who does not want to have to testify in front of that Georgia grand jury. So just while I was sitting here, I saw that the last brief was in, and I thought to myself, okay, that means that I'm going to be sitting by my computer until, I'm never at ease until the court actually rules, and that could be at any time, and it has increased. I didn't have to do that. Now it seems like once a week, I'm waiting for that. It may seem silly to you guys, but you're always on edge because there's no schedule. At least we know when opinions are coming down and the rest of it. And sometimes they write and they explain themselves, and sometimes they don't. And so then you have to say, well, nobody wrote, but maybe, and it has changed radically.
And sometimes you're not sitting by the phone because it's been 10 days since the court got the last brief in the case. And so instead it's 11:55 the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, and the phone is ringing, and it's the court's public information office. This is one of the perks of being a hard pass holder, is you can get on a list of people for them to call when the court acts. And it can happen at some really surprising times.
Amy's not kidding. It was 5 minutes before midnight. The Wednesday before Thanksgiving was the Roman Catholic diocese case, right, in New York.
And it was a big deal.
It was a huge deal, right?
Yeah. So, if you look at the timestamp on my story, it is 2:18 a.m.
Yeah, mine too.
Well, that's better than the two July 2020 execution cases, right, where the decisions came down at 2:17 and 2:46 in the morning.
Or when Ruth Bader Ginsburg pulled an all-nighter, remember?
Yeah.
Yes.
She pulled an all-nighter, which at least was 7.
Yeah, it was Wisconsin. It was one of the Wisconsin cases, right, where she wrote a dissent. Yeah.
And it was emergency docket, right?
Yeah. Kate, I've been sort of pestering Amy and Ariane. Do you have thoughts about sort of how the rise of more sort of off-schedule, right, stuff from the court has complicated the mission of covering it?
I think it's both the unpredictability and the absolute lack of explanation a lot of the time that makes this challenging. So obviously, like, I think that you, Steve, are doing like yeoman's work and keeping all of us like aware that, you know, when there are, you know, ready for decision, fully briefed stay applications and things like that, the court does not go out of its way to make this accessible at all. The court's website, I mean, SCOTUS blog is great. It is both substantively great and navigable and has wonderful user-friendly information. The Supreme Court's website is the opposite of all the things I just said. It's not a useful website, and again, it feels, you know, sort of by design that way. It is now, you know, it now has a section on it. This is a substantive sort of anecdote, but once upon a time, the Supreme Court just is a kind of non-transparency point, but it connects to the website. So once upon a time, the court would revise, sometimes substantially revise, its opinions after issuing them. So it issues a slip opinion, and it's typically about 5 years later that it publishes in the US reports the final opinion. And along the way, it changes the opinions, which I think people realize. If you clerked there, you knew that because you get these drafts from last term or the term ago to make tiny little typographical changes, like, you know, sync up hyphenation across different opinions, things like that. But it turns out, and I did not know this, and I think most people didn't, the court was substantially changing, in sometimes like really meaningful ways, its draft opinions before publishing them, sometimes after lower courts had already relied upon language in opinions. And so a law professor at Harvard noticed this, and it turns out there are some examples, like the Justice O'Connor's concurrence in Lawrence versus Texas actually has some pretty important language that was in the slip opinion and not in the US reports after having been relied on a lot in the interim. Anyway, the court never told anyone this, did it completely sort of on the sneak, and then this law professor published a big article, and the court said, okay, we'll tell you when we're going to revise the opinion. So now it has a section on the website where it uploads highlighted drafts of the original slip opinions to show us where the changes have been made, but only because it was forced to do that. So the court, the theme here is the court really just makes changes only under kind of duress in terms of sort of transparency and accessibility. But just briefly on the shadow docket, I think it's just like, it's so, I mean, Steve, I'm going to just quote something that you said. I'm sure this is right. Last month, the court voted 5-4 to put back on a calendar an execution that 2 lower courts had looked at and determined should not go forward. And the 5 justices who decided that execution had to happen that night didn't tell us why, like didn't give any explanation. This is an interesting case in which all 4 of the women justices dissented and noted that publicly. And so the Supreme Court, again, didn't tell us what the lower courts got wrong. We have no idea. They just said this person will be executed tonight. Now, it turned out he wasn't, because Alabama turned out to be unable to execute him for the same reasons that he had offered and the lower courts had accepted. So all that was right. But, you know, just by grace of the executioners in Alabama was he not executed on the direction with no explanation of 5 justices. And so I think that just like we have to remember each and every one of those events. And that was the 11th, this is the Steve quote, this was the 11th of 12 successive death penalty cases in which the Supreme Court granted emergency relief to allow executions to proceed without any explanation at all. It's pretty galling. But again, it's not, there's no explanation there. And so I think it just makes, I think it is hard to tell those stories, at least on television news where real estate is just so limited and precious. But I think in places like SCOTUS blog and Steve's writing and other places, we can continue to amplify those stories.
But can I just add, one of the explanations that I think the justices would give you, why are you doing this as well? These death penalty cases come to us at the last minute. We don't have time to write anything. It might be kind of cold comfort to the inmate later. There is nothing that would stop them from issuing, and they've done this and for complicated procedural reasons that I won't go into, in other death penalty cases, 2 weeks later, issue your opinion explaining why you did it or why you're dissenting.
Yeah, I guess I think there are also trickier historical examples of that, right? So for the second time today, we're going to talk about the Nazi saboteurs case, where the court, right, agrees to bless the military commission trial and execution, and an opinion will follow, and when they come back, they can't figure out what they want to say about why. Hard to change your mind after someone's dead. But yes, so I guess the corrections point, I think, is such a great example, because here, right, thanks to Lazarus's work, right, the court actually did something salutary, and yet, even then, there's no public notice, right, that the opinion has changed unless you go find it.
I think there's a bot you can follow that will tell you.
Is there a bot?
I think somebody put together like a Twitter robot. Who knows? Maybe it's not on Twitter anymore.
So for example, if you pull up, so this is, sorry, I'm going into why the Blue Book rule is the way it is, law students, right? But the reason why you cite to U.S. and then to SCT if it's not in the US, is because SCT is the Lexis reporter, which is compiling as the court goes, so things are chronological. There will be, if you go on Westlaw for an opinion that has changed, there will be no notation on Westlaw that it has changed. And so unless you both, right, look at the opinion on Westlaw and then go back and see if there was a change, you wouldn't ever know. And so it's just like, even when they're being more transparent, it's still not transparent. All right, I have two more sort of questions, and then I want to throw it open to the audience. So I guess the first is, and Ariane, this picks up on something you had said earlier, and also a running conversation you and I have at least 4 times a week. Right, there is quite obviously a real focus in our contemporary media culture on being first. And I guess I'm curious to all three of you if you think that actually hurts coverage of the court in ways that are unique, right? That, Ariane, you mentioned, like sometimes the headline changes as we actually read the opinion, right? Versus like, maybe if it's the political branches, maybe because you have talking points, maybe because there was some embargoed version, there's more room to fully assess the thing before you're running with the headline.
Well, I do think that now it sort of is, I mean, in the old days, if you would file, I mean, I started out working in the Baltimore Sun, and once your lead was out there and it was printed, you were done. And it was scary. I mean, a lot of people here don't understand that, but now, you know, you can go back and you can add things. And it's not to say that you are changing the story, but you're realizing that if there is an opinion and suddenly in a concurrence out of nowhere, Justice Alito says, you know, you should overturn Obergefell or something like that, then your story changes and you haven't seen it right away and you're moving that up. So it's much more of a chess game. I am not quick, as Steve will tell you. I'm very slow. I'm learning as I get older how it is important to get out there with a line quickly, but I also am cautious. Before I came to CNN, they made a mistake on the healthcare law, and it's very interesting how they made the mistake, because you get a summary, right, of the points, and the government had made a couple of arguments, and so the first point, they rejected that, the second point, they rejected that, and then suddenly you had Roberts saying, yeah, but when it comes to the taxing power, and
but so CNN goes up with the headline, right, ACA not valid under the Commerce Clause.
Right, and it was a mistake, and it was by people who felt pushed. But another thing I think that is really interesting about that is we were all down, I was at ABC at the time, and we're all in the press room, and we're going through it, and we're writing it, but the lucky souls who get to be up in the courtroom, which I have never been able to do, and for us, Joan Biskupic usually does it, which I think would be marvelous, just to be able to sit and listen to somebody read an opinion. I remember I interviewed Dahlia Lithwick, who's a marvelous reporter, and she actually was sitting up there, and it was so interesting, she said, to be in the courtroom, because he was reading his opinion, la la la, and she very much wanted the law upheld, and she's like this, and then I remember saying to me, it was like the great swivel, because all of a sudden Chief Justice Roberts got to the taxing clause, and he goes, by then, and she said, all these heads just went, what? And so that's, so, you know, you can be first, but you have to be darn careful. So I always tell my bosses, that is not my strong suit. Well, there's some reporters on the beat, like Mark Sherman, who's just extraordinary for AP, Greg Storr for Bloomberg. They just are quick like that. I'm not that type of person, and you know, it's important to be first.
I'm also slow.
Are you slow?
Yeah, one thing I want to say.
Can I say neither of you are slow? Like I think.
But I mean, like the CNN example, like part of the problem that day was that the court's website had crashed. And so the only people who had copies of the opinions were the people who were physically at the Supreme Court. And this was a problem that the court had created itself, because this was a case, as many of you will remember, in which the opinion was expected on the last day at the term. So there were literally millions of people trying to log on to the court's website, and various members of the media had gone to the court and said, you know, it would be great if you could email us copies of the opinion as it's released, just in case the court's website crashes. And the court was like, no, we got this. So then that was the other problem, was that people who were at the studio who might have said, I'm looking further in here, and
the court's confidence in its own technology has been repeatedly misplaced.
completely unfounded
Yes.
confidence in its own
But
technology.
so I mean, actually, you know, I work for CNN because of that day, right? Like
so do I.
right?
So do I.
And it's not just, I mean, Amy, it's not just that we were going off that they were going off the paper copy. It's that if you there's a page break in the syllabus between the Commerce Clause holding and the tax holding. And so if you're literally just reading the syllabus over the telephone to the producer in the studio, all they're hearing is not valid under the Commerce Clause, not knowing there's another page coming. This is why, I mean, Ariane doesn't like that I do this, but my dirty little trick, every time we get the opinion online, is the very, very first thing I read is the mandate. At the end of the syllabus, right? Is it reversed? Is it vacated? Is it affirmed? Right? And just like, you know, what is the judgment? Right, and work backwards from there.
Well, some of
It's safe to rely on,
Yeah.
is the very last sentence or two. The rest of it, the syllabus is prepared.
Except when it's affirmed in part, reversed in part,
Exactly.
vacated and remanded. I mean, like,
See,
but
please, that's like the scariest thing in the world. You're like,
part of the
what?
problem too is that the Chief Justice, he likes a little drama
Yeah,
in
he
his
does.
writing. So, you know,
Yes.
whether you're talking about the ACA case, the DACA case, the census case, Justice Kagan
oh, the
is
census case.
the census case, I remember just listening to the silence in the press room as we all tried to figure out what on earth was going on.
And my sobbing.
You know, Justice Kagan and Justice Barrett have these lovely little introductory
Right, it's like,
paragraphs
here's what we're doing.
that says, this is the question in the case. The answer is yes, or the
Love
answer is
them.
no.
Right.
You know,
Love them.
when you're trying to figure out what's going on quickly.
And the chief's like, read to page 96 to find out more.
Here's the question in the case. I'm not going to
So, I mean,
answer it now.
the census case, this was the question about whether the Trump administration had violated the Administrative Procedures Act and trying to put a question about citizenship on the census. And what is the chief writes the opinion of the court, which produces three different majorities on three different questions going in three different directions. So good job, everybody. All right, my last question before we leave, throw it open to you guys. I can't resist, but this is like the media Supreme Court story of the year. We're coming up on 6 months since the leak, right? And I'm curious how each of you thinks, if at all, that the leak is going to change the dynamic between the court and the press in general, and what it says more generally, right, about sort of the court's current relationship with both its press corps and the public.
Can we start?
Please.
So Justice Alito, I guess, was it 2 days ago? My days are blurring, gave a speech. And for the first time, he talked about the leak. And that was important because he actually wrote the opinion, right, that got leaked. And he said it was shocking. He said that he also felt like, and that's particularly poignant today if you've read the news with what happened to Nancy Pelosi's husband, but he said he felt like a target of assassination because the leak led to these protests, and then it led to a guy going to Justice Kavanaugh's house, who's now been charged with attempted murder. But he was very interesting in this speech, Alito, because he talked about using that strong language, and then he said, but now we're moving on. And it feels like, and it was echoing something that Chief Justice Roberts said the months before, and it feels like they know that that was a nightmare for them. Alito said it did impact the relationships in the court at the time. Justice Thomas went as far as saying it felt like an infidelity and that he felt like somebody was always looking over their shoulder. So I think it did very much change the court last term. And I think now they're really making a concerted effort, to just say, okay, we got to move on from last term. That was a nightmare. Let's move on. But one other thing that seemed clear to me, and maybe you guys will disagree, was that it sure sounds like they don't know who that leaker is, because I don't think the way Alito spoke, it suggested that he hadn't been briefed on the leaker. And maybe, just maybe, at this point, they don't want to know anymore. I don't know how much, you lawyers will tell me, if a clerk used to work, if it is a clerk, used to work at the court, and if he doesn't work at the court anymore.
Yeah.
There's nothing they can do
Yeah.
at that point. If it's a clerk, I'm
The former president says send them to prison, right? But that's a separate.
National security.
It's national security, yes. So I can speak to this one. It is not a violation of the Espionage Act to leak a Supreme Court opinion. I guess, so I'm curious, Amy, I'm curious for your thoughts. I also want to sort of throw one more thing into the mix here, which is one of the things I found striking about the leak story is that as it evolved, it actually was a multiple leak story. Right, like I am still sort of floored by the Washington Post story, I think it was the Saturday of the leak, where there are multiple, quote, lawyers close to the conservative justices, unquote, going on record about what was said at conference. Like that strikes me as almost as big a deal in the story, and should we expect more of that?
I mean, I will say, like, in terms of whether or not the leak affected the relationship between the court and the press, I don't really see, because there's not really that much of a relationship. I mean, Kate can talk more about this. I would expect it to have a tremendous impact inside the building. And I think this was really sort of, it's not like any reporter is ever calling up someone at the Supreme Court and saying, can you get me a copy of the draft opinion? Like, it's just so unthinkable. And when they've had other leaks, whether you're talking about Jan Crawford after the Affordable Care Act, the leaks surrounding the leak, nobody's talking about investigating them.
So why is the draft? Maybe Kate, this is for you. Right? Why is the draft different? Right? I mean, we've had leaks before, right? The result of Roe was leaked, right? Jan's leak about the switch at conference in the ACA case. Jones reporting, right, about sort of some of the similar horse trading and other sort of behind the scenes stuff at conference. I mean, these are all pretty significant leaks. What is so qualitatively different, or maybe not qualitatively different, right, about the draft?
Yeah, no, I think it is, because it's sort of midstream, right? And that does feel like an effort to alter the trajectory in a way that those other instances were not. And so I do think that it feels qualitatively different. One thing, in addition to the Alito comments, Gorsuch was saying something kind of different early last month, right? So, or in early September. Remember, he said he was the one who told us there's a committee that has been put together to investigate the leak. We knew that the marshal of the court was, charged by the Chief Justice with overseeing it, but apparently there's a committee, and he said, they've been busy, we're looking forward to seeing their findings, hopefully soon. I wonder whether Alito, having now said something very different 6 weeks later, does suggest either they know and they're not going to tell us, or they have, for some reason, decided to stop the investigation. But, of course, it's the court. So as, everything we've said so far will be clear. They're not going to affirmatively tell us the answer. They'll just, I think, let it trail off and leave us all to kind of speculate or wonder.
In 2085, our grandkids will, find out.
Yeah, I mean, I think it probably really does. That place does take confidentiality norms incredibly seriously. And obviously, whoever decided to take this extraordinary step, was really, really concerned in one direction or another. Continues to seem likely to be either somebody who really liked the draft opinion and was worried about, a wobbly fifth vote leaked to cement the majority, or somebody who was really scared and kind of horrified by what the court was doing, wanted to kind of give voters and maybe actors in states a little lead time to start to mobilize to shore up state law protections for reproductive rights or things like that. That, at least, those are the strategic reasons that I can imagine that, obviously point in different directions for doing it, but it's an extraordinary step, absolutely. But I also think that if we're going to keep talking about the leak, we also need to talk a lot about, equally maybe, about Ginny Thomas's continuing activities. I think this is really important. I think it is really important that the spouse of a sitting Supreme Court justice was, seeking to lobby state legislators to throw out the results of a presidential election. In at least one case, it does seem extremely questionable for Justice Thomas to have participated in the decision, right, involving the National Archives records. So I think that if we're talking, I think that honestly, those two things probably need equal airtime.
But Kate, Ginny Thomas told the January 6th committee that she never speaks to her husband about any cases in the Supreme Court.
It's just I've said this on my podcast, every relationship is different, and I don't know anything about the internal dynamics, but it just feels like when you're working day in and day out to do something that, it seems from her own account, was to stop the theft of a presidential election. She was passionate about it, I think deeply committed to it, though obviously incorrect, but the underlying premises and the tactics. It just defies logic to me that she would not have mentioned this activity to her husband. I just don't see it.
So we have about 10 minutes for questions. I'd love to ask Mikhail and Katie to do their thing one more time. I will just say my theory about the leak has always been and has yet to be disproven, that it was a secondary leak, right? That a justice or a clerk shared the draft under very strict confidence with someone in the inner circle, a former clerk, right, whatever, and that the leak came from the person who was the downstream recipient of the and which would lead to both making it very hard to find out who did it, and also maybe not wanting the court to make a big deal out of it because the initial offense might not have been quite as malicious.
And just while we're waiting for if anyone has any questions, the one thing I did find out is that those opinions were not exactly under lock and key. They really weren't. I think there was just this implicit understanding that nobody would leak it, but I have found that they were not exactly under leaking.
I mean, and you say like it's not malicious, but if you are a justice and you share it with someone else, no matter what kind of conditions you put on it, like you can't really complain.
Right. No. Right. So the possibility that it was a justice who shared it with someone who and didn't expect that person to share it further, and then that person did.
That's a big assumption. Yeah.
I'm going to stop talking. Questions?
I just wanted to bring up the topic that you studiously avoided this morning and talked about anyway, is coverage of appointment and confirmation hearings. Is there a way to do this without this conveying that this is the one democratic moment that we have, and thereafter forget about the political branches having anything to do with the court?
So I think the question, right? Coverage of the confirmation hearings and confirmation process, is there a way to sort of, try to make that moment more accessible, less politicized, both?
I mean, I'm not sure what the answer to that is. I mean, I will say much along the lines of what Ariane talked about earlier with the cussing cheerleader case. There has been a lot of criticism of confirmation hearings as sort of kabuki theater. You don't learn anything about the nominee's views. And whether or not you think that's true, I do think that confirmation hearings continue to serve a really useful purpose. They get sort of ordinary Americans talking about things like stare decisis and some of the cases that are going to come before the court. And I do think you get a really good sense of what someone's going to be like as a justice by watching them for hours and hours during the confirmation hearings.
But covering them is a different matter, because you've got justices who really don't want to answer questions about Roe v. Wade, and they want to talk about their respect for stare decisis and settled law. And then you've got senators who really want to make their own points and are playing to their constituents. And so it's really hard to cover because those two ships sometimes are just passing.
But then, there are lots of ways in which I think the Kavanaugh confirmation process was exceptional, but he goes on Fox News, right? He does this long sit-down interview, right, with Fox News, which seems to be inviting the media into sort of the questioning process in a way that, was tightly controlled and not open, and maybe that's an awkward precedent to set.
I feel like a senator should, invite law professors to actually question the witnesses, what they should do. That would make for better hearings, that's all.
Let the law professors ask the question.
I mean, occasionally they'll deputize staff members. It's a sort of serious suggestion. I now can't remember if it was the first or the first of the Trump impeachments, right, involved staff questions to witnesses. Josh has probably written about this, right? But it's not, and in the Kavanaugh hearing as well, right? Blasey Ford was questioned by a state assistant district attorney. And then the senators decided to take the mics back because they felt like they were not sufficiently in the spotlight. But I don't know, actually, just to the kind of it's senators grandstanding, that's not useful. But hearing from the witnesses, I agree with Amy, actually is useful, and it's worth salvaging these kind of potential public education moments that the hearings present. So that would be one way to do it. It doesn't need to be law professors, but getting the senators out of that, the kind of the whole process, at least, right? Yeah, so uphill battle, but I think that would help.
Get in between senators and the microphone. That's definitely good. That's going to work almost as well as Supreme Court reform. Michaela, do you have another one back there? Or Katie? I didn't see.
So I just wanted to get your response on Justice Alito's speech he gave in Rome a few months ago, where he actually cites, he talks about foreign leaders' response to the Dobbs decision. And I can't really think of another time where a justice has publicly remarked on foreign leaders and their reactions or disapproving of the majority opinion in a certain case. And just wanted you to talk a little bit about that.
I think so. I think we are out of practice of the justices pontificating publicly on things like that. But I actually think historic, like, you know, if you, I mean, someone mentioned the scorpions in the bottle this morning. I mean, if you talk, like, the kind of stuff the justices would do in the press in the 40s and 50s, I think would floor some of us if we talked about it today. There is, I mean, in the court's history, the most famous interpersonal feud among the justices is literally called the Black-Jackson feud. And it's basically a war that Black and Jackson fight through intermediaries in the press. About Jackson going to Nuremberg, about Black's participation in cases in which he might have had a conflict. So, you know, there are various features of Justice Alito's public speeches I find less than ideal. The notion that, like, he has opinions about whether world leaders should be talking about his opinions is actually, to me, relatively low on the list, but
Sorry, I found it pretty galling, honestly, only because it's in the context of the court's performance of, you know, sort of this kind of apolitical role, and it just, I think it's right that it's not historically so anomalous, but I think in the present moment and in the context of the Supreme Court's self-conception and self-projection as a body that stands somewhat outside of politics, it just like felt like a partisan screed that was wildly inappropriate, and his facial hair looked terrible. He was like really weirdly bearded up during that talk in Rome.
But so is it the substance or is it the optics? Like, if he gives that speech at, like, I don't know why he'd be invited to the ACS convention, but if he gives it at the ACS convention versus giving it in Rome, right? Like, I mean, and you know, Justice Barrett, right, giving a speech about how we're not partisans at the Mitch McConnell Center with Mitch McConnell sitting right behind her. Like, is the problem what they're saying, or is the problem where they're saying it?
It's a combination. Yeah, no, please go ahead. Yeah.
I was thinking that he really stepped on his message, though, because he was in Rome, and I was listening along, and it was you know, he was making points about religious liberty that were deep and provocative, and then he just does that, shifts gears, and then I'm like, all right, we got a story, and, you know, everything he said about his religious liberty point of views went away. But I'll say something else that he gave in the speech the other night, and this goes to something that I'd like to do better. He did this talk at the Heritage Foundation, and he talked about campus speech, and it was provocative. He talked about religious liberty, and it was provocative. And then he made that comment about targeted assassinations, and then he responded to the leak, and then he got into it without saying their names, Kagan and Sotomayor. And I covered the last two because I was on deadline and I thought that was important. And I want to go back and find ways to use what else he said, because it was he was giving a weighty, interesting speech. And I wish that I had more time that night as I was filing in a speech that I'd only been told about an hour before to add all that in. So that's bad on us when we can't get it all in there.
And one thing I will say of all of the various speeches since the Dobbs ruling in particular that I've really focused on have been the remarks by Justice Kagan.
Yeah.
Because it's not like what they're saying, but who is saying it. And Justice Kagan, I think, has always regarded herself as someone who can work with her colleagues on the bench, who can build bridges. She was famous for doing that as the dean of Harvard Law School. And now for her to go and give a couple of speeches where she talks about and questions the court's legitimacy, you know, she is talking to her colleagues, and this is like the signal that she really sees some serious problems with the internal dynamics of the court that she cannot solve. When she's on the bench during the October sitting, she used to like be talking, you could sort of see her talking to her colleagues on the bench with her questions for the lawyers, and now she's talking to the public. Yeah. As much as she's talking to her colleagues.
That is so fascinating, because Alito, he was asked particularly about her comments, and he didn't name names. He goes, oh yeah, we all get along. But anybody who suggests that this court is illegitimate, And he's talking about Kagan, make no mistake about it, and they sit next to each other in court, which
I mean,
is,
his Notre Dame speech, his Notre Dame speech about the shadow docket, right? Like, he
Yeah.
says, some people have said
Yeah,
X.
like your colleague.
Right, like, it was Kagan's dissent in the SB, he's literally responding to the SB 8 dissent and not, and blaming it on Adam Serwer, right? As opposed to Justice Kagan. So, yeah. I think we have time for maybe 2 more questions. Sam, does that sound right?
I'm wondering if you could comment on the media consumption of the justices. I'm thinking back to the Scalia interview where he said, I read the Washington Times, I can't read the Post anymore. What are they reading? Are they reading the Volokh conspiracy like in real time? Are the clerks reading those blogs?
What are the justices reading? Like, what media do we think the justices are consuming? So,
Which ones?
I will say, I speak from some direct experience. They are reading way too much of their own press. Right? And what I mean by that is, you know, multiple of the justices are reading not just what you might think of as aligned publications, but maybe counter-aligned, if not publications, then authors, and stewing about it.
And they're on Twitter.
And
they're reading Twitter.
If you gave me 3.5 as the over-under on the number of justices who have Twitter burner accounts, I would take the over. And I don't mean their clerks telling them, I mean like the justices. So yeah. I think they consume an awful lot of press, and I suspect they consume way too much.
Yeah, so that's volume. And I mean, look, all the data shows, like all of us are increasingly siloed in the media ecosystems in which we reside. I suspect that is true about the justices as well. So I doubt they're all drawing on a broad, diverse array of media sources. I do, you know, I know that Thomas, you know, says he doesn't like really consume any media, but I know he does. And I think that, you know, that occasionally you sort of have your kind of like ears perk up, that there'll be a turn of phrase or a reference that sort of seems to signal that somebody's spending a lot of time either watching Fox News or watching MSNBC, and you know, so I think that there are signs and signals, but we don't really know, but it matters a lot, right? Like, and the one other thing I'll ask, I think that the press office we know is now putting, they have like the PIO is putting a bulletin board of like excerpts from, including of tweets. Have you guys, so I haven't been back to the court and since it's reopened, have you, is that something that is in the press room? And like, is there a display that you have seen that you could divulge that like that is like a bulletin board? No. Okay, no, it must not be in the public area, the press area then.
I thought what it was that the PIO, someone said in an interview that the PIO is circulating to the justices.
Okay.
Clips from the press that includes tweets.
Oh my goodness.
But I thought there was a suggestion there was a physical repository somewhere, but.
So I would say, I think it was Alito's concurrence in Bruin, right, the gun case, that talks about the Buffalo shooting, right, in ways that are incredibly laced with some of the right-wing media treatment, right? And is that the justices or is that their clerks? I mean, you know, it's entirely possible this is actually the clerks.
There's even a weird reference in Thomas's dissent from a denial of a case asking the court to reconsider New York Times versus Sullivan to Pizzagate.
Yes.
Interestingly, not to like subscribe to it, to suggest that the existence of the peddlers of conspiracy theories and their excessive protection by the Times versus Sullivan standard is something that should be revisited, which is like a little, you know, rich, I think, coming from Thomas, actually, especially sort of in everything we know in the last year about Ginny's activities. But for sure, there are those references.
So insofar as we have circumstantial, and in some cases maybe non-circumstantial evidence that they are reading their press, does that change how you guys think about what you're doing? Like, because I don't suspect you guys ever think of your audience as them.
Well, yes and no.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, because, you know, we know where our readers are coming from.
Indeed, you have the
and
IPs.
there are a lot coming from within, the call is coming from within the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
You know, does it change how I write? Never.
All right, Ariane, last word.
I'm just trying to think of them. No, I don't, it doesn't impact me at all. I write what I write.
Cool. All right, well, Kate, Amy, Ariane, all of you guys, thank you so much.
I'm gonna end briefly, believe me, where we began, which is with thank yous. thank you all for staying. You were the one people that I didn't thank earlier, which is people who come to these events are really valuable, and obviously the event would be meaningless without people listening and paying attention. And so thank you all for being here. I once again want to thank all of the Law Journal staff for the work that they have done in putting this together and the work they will continue to do in getting the written contributions that come out of this published. And I want to thank the participants primarily for their contributions to this really wonderful discussion, and most especially to our lecturer, but also permanent moderator and facilitator of this conversation. A really, really long day for him, but I really appreciate everything that Steve Vladeck has brought to us today. So thank you.